Hello and welcome to another of the Texas Eco Photo Festival webinar series. I'm Jill Struby, the chair of the Smithville Area Chamber of Commerce and one of the founders of the EcoFest. Today we're talking with Dr. Kevin Anderson, who will take us on an adventure along the Colorado River with a presentation he calls Fluvial Life, the Nature of the Colorado River. Although this is the first time the EcoFest and the photo festivals are linked together, both of them have been a tradition in Smithville for about 10 years. We are experimenting with this connection between eco and photo and the virtual format, and we truly appreciate you, the viewer, and your interest in these topics. If you are interested in taking stunning photos of the river and its wildlife, please tune into the program with Kevin Hutchison and check out the other presentations on a wide variety of topics connecting eco with photo. Dr. Anderson is the coordinator of the Austin Water Center for Environmental Research at Hornsby Bend Biosolids Management Plant. If you are in the Bastrop area or elsewhere along the Colorado River, you may also know him from his work coordinating the Colorado River Corridor Partnership. He began working on issues related to the environment on a farm in Pennsylvania and worked to further environmental awareness and research in Maryland, Hungary, and Ohio before he came to Texas. Although he started his doctoral studies at UT Austin's philosophy department, he was convinced to make a change and work towards a PhD in geography, which culminated in a dissertation entitled Marginal Nature, Urban Wastelands and the Geography of Nature. He has been at Hornsby Bend since 2000, putting into practice his research interests, which include urban ecology, rivers and riparian ecology, soil and sustainable agriculture, environmental history, and of course, philosophy. The mission of the Center for Environmental Research is urban ecology and sustainability, community education and research. Hornsby Bend is a 1,200-acre world-renowned bird observatory, which reopened to the public on June 15th after the COVID shutdown. The area is operated by the Austin Water Utility. That's where they make the Dillo dirt, and it's located on a wetland area just to the east side of Austin. The first birders made their way to this site in 1959, and it has been extremely popular ever since. Kevin, we are so grateful that you're able to be with us today for this year's Eco Photo Fest. We have been trying to get you to Smithville for a few years, so we're really happy you can make it on this virtual platform. So I'm turning the screen share over to you now.
Great, thank you. Let me get my screen shared. Here we go. And let's get to work talking about fluvial life and the nature of the Colorado River. As Jill mentioned, I work here on the river at the Center for Environmental Research at Hornsby Bend. I spend a lot of time on the river, and with the Austin Water Utility, we're dedicated to protecting this river from Austin down through Smithville. One of the challenges with talking about the Colorado River is sorting out which Colorado River we're going to talk about. And in our case, it's the Texas Colorado River, but there is another Colorado, a much bigger river that gets even more attention. And it took a Texas singer-songwriter to sort out the difference. Jimmy Dale Gilmore, whose wife, Janet, is a water monitor, volunteer water monitor for LCRA on this Colorado River. Famously, on their first date, she introduced Jimmy, who grew up in West Texas, to the Colorado River. And he said back to her, "No, honey, that's a lake. That's Town Lake." And she said, "No, it's the Colorado River." And of course, out of that, he got a song, Another Colorado River, where his true love taught him the difference between a lake and a river. And that's part of what we're going to talk about in this presentation too, the difference between still water and flowing water. Fluvial means flowing, and we're going to trace the life of this Colorado River through our area. The Texas Colorado River drains almost 40,000 square miles in its basin. That basin stretches into New Mexico, but it's a rare thing for any water to come out of that part of New Mexico. The river starts to flow somewhere, Dawson County, depends on what the rains are like that year. 862-mile long river, the 18th longest in the United States. So it stretches across that great transition from the high plains to the coast in Texas, moving through the Edwards Plateau, the hill country, and then into our region. When we talk about a river as a geographer, we think about it through that whole process from its upper course through the middle course to the lower course. It's famously been described almost like a human life, where that youthful stage of the upper course is steep and rugged. The middle course winds sedately through wide valleys in its mature stage. And then the lower course in old age is a somewhat aimless course towards final extinction at the sea. Those kinds of metaphorical trappings are something that come with rivers, but also it helps us understand that at the beginning of a river in its headwaters in that upper course, usually the slopes are steeper. Typically they begin in mountains. In the case of our Colorado River, begins up on the high plains at elevation. It moves through that more rugged, steep sloped area into a middle course, a kind of maturity where the river comes out of that deeper erosional valleys into a plain that it carves back and forth as it erodes that more gentle slope. And then as it reaches the sea, in our case, Matagorda Bay and the Gulf of Mexico, it's moving through an almost flat landscape, again, meandering, moving back and forth and slowing down. We're going to focus on this middle course, this stretch from Austin down through Smithville that is a maturing stage. It is a meandering stage of the river. And it's about 90 miles between Longhorn Dam, the last big dam on the river, through Smithville. We spent a lot of time on this stretch of river, learning about it. We also recognize that there is something different about this stretch of river from the river up to that point as it flows out of the hill country and across the Balcones Escarpment. The slope and the land become much flatter. And that releases the river to do two things. One, deposit a lot of sand and gravel over the hundreds of thousands of years that it's flowed. And this alluvium has been laid down, as you can see from this map, from Austin down through Bastrop and Smithville, a fairly wide plain that as you dig down through there, you find two things, sand and gravel, but also water, because this is the alluvial aquifer of the Colorado River. As it lays down that sand and gravel, it creates a stratum that it can fill with its water. As the river goes into flood or high flow, the water moves into this aquifer, and then during dry periods when the river is low, that aquifer feeds the river with the flow. Again, part of the character of the river between Austin and Smithville, and underneath that ground then is this alluvial aquifer. Significantly for Texas in terms of water resources, we largely neglect these alluvial aquifers and we don't protect them. The only exception is what's considered a minor aquifer, the Brazos River aquifer. The state literally doesn't recognize them as existing. The Water Development Board doesn't include them on these major or minor aquifer maps of Texas. And for a geographer, when it's not on the map, you get interested very quickly. Of course, all of this is bound to change through this time of water scarcity and the search for water resources in Texas are turning towards these alluvial aquifers. No doubt the Colorado alluvial aquifer too. And that's part of why we created this group called the Austin-Bastrop River Corridor Partnership back in 2003 with folks from Bastrop and Smithville and Austin. We decided we'd start meeting every other month to sit down and talk. Those talks morphed into workshops, and those workshops turned into an online report, Discovering the Colorado, a vision for the Austin-Bastrop River Corridor. You can go and find that online and find out more about that partnership, the open conversation about the future of the river corridor. What we all agreed on were 4 goals. One, sustainability for this stretch of river, and that depends very much on the second goal, riparian management, and I'll talk more about that in terms of nature. Uh, the area has been changed so much since first settlement in the 1820s to the 1830s up to the present. And so there's a lot of restoration of nature, of the habitats along the river corridor that needs to be done. And then most fundamental is public awareness. And that's why I'm talking to you today and why we keep having those meetings and reports. And behind it all is the title of this presentation, Fluvial Life and the Nature of the Colorado River, because the river is not just for humans, it's for non-humans as well. And we're all part of this community of flowing water or fluvial life that live on this middle stretch of the Colorado. Now, as a fluvial geomorphologist, as part of what I do, as a ecologist as well, we tend to think as science types of river systems as ecosystems. And to get tenure at a university, you have to come up with a model, and there are all sorts of models for river ecosystems. And these concepts are focus on different aspects of how ecology works. The dominant one right now in the US is called the river continuum concept, but there are lots of other concepts. I'm going to focus on the river continuum concept, but understand that these are all just models, ways of thinking about how rivers work that change over time, and some are right and some are wrong. The river continuum concept, or RCC, is interesting because it thinks about the river from its headwaters, that upper course, to its mouth in terms of the food webs and the nutrient cycles of the river, of all the organisms living in that river, collaborating to process the nutrients that go into that water. All of that is nature. The RCC begins its focus by looking at the smallest of those creatures that are in the river, the organisms that swim in that water and live on the bottom of the river, from microbes to insect larvae that process those nutrients in very fundamental ways. This model is useful because they describe communities of those macroinvertebrates that are different for the headwaters, to the middle of the river, to the mouth of the river. And so if you go out and you look at your river, whichever one it might be, and you look at that component of nature, you can compare it to other rivers at different parts of that journey from headwaters to the sea. So it's a very interesting and complex and robust model that begins by focusing on biogeochemistry. So what's biogeochemistry? Well, it's biological organisms producing nutrients that are in chemical forms, either in soil or, in the case of fluvial life, in water. When we look at soil, like a farmer would, like a terrestrial ecologist would, you're looking at a column of soil that goes up and down, or maybe just a meter square, a meter cube. There, you're looking at nutrient states in a fixed system. And maybe those nutrients change from the first inch of soil down a foot or two. But when you take all of that meter square and get it in motion, moving across the landscape as a meter square of water, well, now those nutrients don't just move downward, they move laterally. And so the nutrient cycles that may be up and down in soil now become spirals as those nutrients move down the length of a stream or river. So these nutrient spirals, this downstream transport, is a big part of what we try to understand when we look at, say, a molecule that contains phosphorus and nitrogen. And what happens to those atoms of phosphorus and nitrogen, not in a fixed meter square, but as it moves along the river. And of course, what happens to them is they're taken up in organisms as things are eaten or decay, and then they move through that system as the water flows. what you get then is a very complex food web. And food webs are, in freshwater ecology, understood to start in two ways. They all begin with plants. And those plants can be alive, green plants that may be in the water, and those get eaten by herbivores of some sort. Herbivores can be insect larvae, or they can be fish, or they can be the insects themselves. And then something eats those insects or fish. So one pathway is through living plant material, but another pathway for nutrients going into these food webs is through death, as leaves decay and fall, hit the water, and then the organisms that help decay them break them down. The result of all of that is that these fluvial systems, these streams and rivers, end up in that water carrying three things. One, the water itself, of course, and then in that water is dissolved and suspended materials. Some of those materials are sand and gravel and silt, and those all move downstream too. The other material is dissolved organic material. Or DOM, as ecologists like to call it. And dissolved organic material, along with silt, can turn water to look hazy, or we call it turbid in ecology. And in the middle part of a river, like ours, that water is typically going to be kind of hazy because it's carrying a lot of that material. All of that is natural. It's not pollution. It's part of the food web of the stream. It also can carry very large woody debris. And so big trees and branches are also part of that system and natural to the ecology of the river. All of that is the nature of the river. In the river continuum concept, then, we're looking at the whole river food web from headwaters down to the mouth of the river. We're looking at different organism types, the organisms that shred the plant material and the organisms that collect that material to use it, the grazers or scrapers, for instance, snails that move along those surfaces, and then all the things that eat those things. That's the complete food web. And what you have here then is this idealized image of the perfect river and how all the nature of that river will collaborate to keep it clean and functional and robust and biologically diverse. Again, it's an ideal setting. We do lots of things as humans that change that and degrade it or modify it in some way. All of that is open to study. The first place you begin to study, though, and if you're interested in fluvial ecology, you don't look for big organisms, you look for the little organisms that do all that work at the base of the food web that is part of the river continuum concept. And we have on a rock that you might pick up from the river, all that green stuff that hangs out there. Well, that's an ecosystem in itself. It's called the periphyton, and it's a mixture of algae and cyanobacteria and other detritus that attaches to stones. There in it too, layers or zones of life, from the outer layer to the inner layer of that mini ecosystem. On each speck of sand or gravel or rock that's in the river, you have a complex ecosystem as well. So in terms of photography, you have lots of opportunities for macro photography to try to understand what's there and see it and document it. That surface habitat is the most important habitat for nutrient cycling, for cleaning rivers, for maintaining water quality in the river, because it's the microorganisms there, all the way down to diatoms and bacteria, that do the bulk of the processing of nutrients that enter the river or stream system. So it's not only complex, but it's incredibly fundamental to the health of the river itself. In our stretch of river, in this middle stage of the river, if you walk out into the stream and pick up a stone, you're going to see that rich periphyton that covers the stone or the gravel that you pick up. But you can also see larger organisms that play a role. And most significantly in our stretch of river, it's blue suckers, this fish that hangs out on those stones. And especially adapted to graze on the periphyton on this part of the river ecosystem. So the middle course of the river in terms of its microhabitats is incredibly important. But more broadly, the middle part of a system, of a river system, is its richest in terms of habitat diversity, and so the richest in terms of biodiversity, because there are lots of different types of habitat that are formed as a river meanders back and forth across the landscape. And it's the landscape of Bastrop County as the river moves through it. So I want to dwell a little on what that structure in terms of geography looks like. That middle course then has a wider channel. As you move up into the headwaters of a river or stream, the channel narrows, gets rougher, full of debris. Here, the river widens out. The trees can no longer touch crossing that river channel. It's too wide. And so lots more solar energy gets added to that system. And of course, on the Earth, solar energy is the base of all of the energy system of life. And so as you add more of that, as the interlocking tree canopies can't cover and shade the stream anymore, the water gets warmer, less of the tree leaves are part of that system, and light can reach that periphyton, the bottom of the river, again, increasing in-stream primary productivity of that food web. An abundance of life is there. And then structurally, this part is so interesting because this is the aquatic life world where erosional zones and depositional zones are the most complex and active. Because as that water moves off of a sharp slope, the water begins to rotate and sinuously move across the landscape, creating the bends or meanders that are typical and common for our stretch of river, where you have an erosional bank on one side and a point bar or depositional bank on the other. If you've ever floated the river in a kayak or raft or canoe, you'll feel that water moving under you. And it doesn't move as a straight column. It doesn't move in a straight line. It spirals, snakes its way sinuously downstream. And it's that spiraling that does the erosion on the banks of the river. And you'll feel it lift you in your boat as you go over those currents. And that lift is part of the erosional complexity of what's happening in the stream at this point. And as you get erosion, you get new structures to the stream and then new opportunities for nature to live. Part of that erosional process leaves these deep pools, deep and wide, where the water slows down. The reduced velocity means that you'll have deposition of sand and gravel. You'll have silt suspended there. And the slower moving water will support organisms similar to what you'd find in lakes. Lakes where water doesn't flow and move. And so you get a structure there from the deep bottom to the middle of the water column to the surface. And it's here where dragonflies and damselflies will come to lay their eggs, and dragonfly and damselfly larvae will emerge and move out into shallower water to do the predation that's part of that system. It's here where you're going to find fish like spotted and alligator gar hanging out, where they don't have to use as much energy to fight a current. And all fishermen know to go check out these pools for fish. But with that too, you then have the faster flowing areas. As deposition occurs, the channel gets more shallow, water moves more quickly. And this is the forms of water that we call riffles, where shallow portions of a stream move fast and are more turbulent. They have more oxygen in the water then, and you have more surface area of rocks and gravel that the water flows over. Fewer plants can grow there. There's some specialized plants like yellow stargrass pictured here, introductions like hydrilla that will grow on these riffles and provide more habitat for fish and other organisms. This is where you're going to find insect larvae like mayflies and caddisflies and riffle beetles and water pennies living on and under those rocks utilizing that section of riffle for their homes. And part of that structure then is the water moving into a riffle area. And we have specialized terms for the zones above and below riffles. And these are called runs and glides. A glide is the area where the water's slower moving and non-turbulent, often right before a riffle. You get that sort of structure. A run is a more shallow part where it's fast moving, but a little less turbulent than when it's going over rocks. And in the case of our stretch of river, this is where you're going to find gar spawning in the springtime with lots of small males chasing around, one large female. In this picture, you can see 10 to 15 of these males moving around trying to get the privilege of partnering with the female. That's what you're going to find in the erosional zone riffle run glide area. And when the water stops flowing, it drops that sediment load it's carrying, and you get gravel bars forming. And these gravel bars form in particular parts on the stream where the water slows down enough to allow for alluvial deposits. And of course, when those bed materials, when the gravel and pebbles form these bars, suddenly you have opportunities for terrestrial ecosystems to form, for cottonwoods and sycamores and other trees to sprout and grow, and all of that changing over time. These gravel bars are always on our stretch of river coupled with a cut bank or bluff on the other side of the river. The deposition occurring on the slow flow side and the erosion on those bluffs or cut banks where the path of deepest flow cuts them down. All of this can lead to a superabundance of organisms. And when we look just at the base of that food web, just above bacteria and microorganisms to the benthic macroinvertebrates that live in these rivers, there are events like mayfly blooms, which happen on the Colorado between Austin and Bastrop, and famously happen on the Mississippi in such abundance that you can pick it up on radar as these mayflies emerge. But I've been in mayfly blooms that are similar on the Colorado. You have to be there at a particular time, and they only last for an hour or so as mayflies molt from their nymph stage and emerge as duns and then fly off, often only living for 12 to 24 hours just to mate and lay eggs and die on the river. A very dramatic example of nature on the river that if you spend enough time out there, you'll be lucky enough to see. On the river is also linked to the land, though, and that transition zone between the channel of the river and fluvial flowing water to land, we have a special term for that, and that's the riparian zone. That's that waterway margin that's the transition from terrestrial upland ecosystems to aquatic ecosystems. Riparian zones vary in width. They can be miles wide in really flat meandering rivers like the Mississippi or further down the Colorado towards Matagorda. Or they can be very narrow in the case of the Pecos River in West Texas that you can see here in this picture. But the riparian zone always is that green ribbon that follows the river channel and supports tremendous biodiversity here in Texas. And it supports that biodiversity because it's also, like the river channel itself, a complex ecological system that filters water and organic matter and sediment and nutrients. It provides coarse woody debris for the river channel, but also collects that. And then it holds the banks of the river together. All of this is defined by what we call hydric soils, then soils that are saturated with water for part of the year, and then only plants that can tolerate that kind of saturation will grow there. Storing water then is part of the function of a healthy riparian system. And here on the middle part of the Colorado River, they're incredibly important for that alluvial aquifer, for the health of the river, for the flow of the river in low water times, and then for supporting the biological diversity of the ecosystem of the river. So one way metaphorically we can think about it, you have the flowing water of the river, and then you have this riparian sponge of sand and gravel held together by roots that absorbs water and holds it, and then slowly releases it back to the river. The key to all of this is that you have riparian vegetation to do that function. This is why we don't want to see the river mowed down to its bank, all trees removed or minimal trees. You need the whole complexity of that system for it to work. You need what we call colonizers, you need stabilizers, you need woody plants to make the ecosystem process of the river riparian system work. And it's very dynamic. It is not static. It changes over time. It changes year to year. There are lots of resources to learn about this. One of the best is Your Remarkable Riparian Guide, which is online. The Guadalupe River Authority put it online and helped fund it years ago. The city of Austin has the Central Texas Wetland Plants Guide, which is online. All of it to help you understand what that riverbank system is doing. What it's doing is critical for the fluvial life of the river too, because it, in proper functioning condition, it dissipates stream energy, it improves water quality and quantity, it filters sediment, it does all of these ecosystem services for us and for the river to keep it healthy, clean, and flowing. So not only the river channel and the flowing water itself, but its riparian system is part of that overall system of the nature of the river. If you're interested in more of that, go find the Texas Riparian Association website. A bunch of us helped to found that back in 2001. And its work focuses on everything from rural waterways to urban riparian systems too. And I want to now end with focus on the critters themselves, the nature themselves, the things that you will want to go out and try to get pictures of when you're on the river, but it takes time to do that. The diversity of life, in particular in this middle course, is the greatest of all the river. And one of the most elusive and fun critters to go and try and find on our stretch of river are otters. Now, when Smithville and Bastrop were founded in the 1820s and 1830s, Austin, 1839, otters were common on the river. And they were common there for two reasons. One, the habitat was perfect. The water quality was great, so there were lots of fish for the otters to dine on. And what the humans did was come in and cut down that ancient bottomland forest, destroy the habitat, and hunt and trap those otters out of existence as well. Since the early 20th century, Texas Parks and Wildlife have worked hard to reestablish otters on our rivers. And the good news is that in the last 30 years, otters have reestablished on our stretch of the Colorado River, partially because the habitat, that forest, has come back and it continues to come back. And typically, there are two ways to see otters and photograph them. One is using a wildlife camera and catching a view of them at night, like my picture here of 3 otters at Hornsby Bend with the wildlife camera. Two is to go out and look for sign of otters, and that's everything from their dens under logs in the riverbank to them playing on those sand and gravel banks along the stretch of river. How will you know it's an otter? Well, the tracks are distinctive, but it's that tail, and you'll see the drag marks of that tail as they run around on these riverbanks. But if you're lucky, you'll be out on the river and get a visit from otters themselves. And on our river trips, we're always looking for otters, and often they'll pop their heads up, look around, smile at you, and shoot off and disappear pretty quickly. So it's hard to get good pictures of them from a kayak or canoe, but sometimes you can, like we did here. But don't mistake them for the other critter that's returned to the river. And beavers return to the river quicker than otters. And these beavers have been established longer. And beavers were a fundamental part of the hydrology of the Colorado River when Anglos arrived and began to cut down that forest. They were managing the forest for thousands and thousands of years. On our river, in the middle course of the river, they don't build dams across the river, which of course wouldn't survive the first flood. They burrow into the banks and build dens there. But you can see their handiwork of cutting down trees, of eating that inner bark, which is the food for beavers, and leaving those beaver sticks up and down the riverbank. And in the evening, typically, we frequently see these beavers moving along the river. They're primarily an evening, nighttime critter, not a daytime critter. But a daytime critter that you might also see is another one that's returned to this stretch of river. Alligators were part of the Colorado system when the Anglos began changing this landscape with settlement, and they disappeared for a time, but they too are back on our stretch of river. And if you're lucky, you'll be going by and see one on the bank. They're not common yet, but their numbers are increasing just like otters. Another part of that system, in their case, just like beavers and otters, they depend on the banks of the river. They depend on those riparian systems as part of their home turf too. But here in the fall, the most visible things you're going to see on the river are the migratory birds and resident birds that come and use our middle stretch of river. And the flocks of waterfowl that come through in September, October, November, are repeated in the spring through March and April, always in motion. These birds, the waterfowl that come through, some of them have been to the Arctic to breed and are coming back again, headed to Argentina for the winter, or Brazil, or more locally to Mexico and Central America, but all of them using the middle stretch of river as a way station in that journey. A resident bird that is relatively new to this system is our logo bird for Hornsby Bend, the black-bellied whistling duck. And it's this time of year when black-bellied whistling ducks have their second clutch of eggs, and the little ones are out on the river. That's my favorite time of year, and this is my favorite bird. Black-bellied whistling ducks, along with wood ducks, are called tree ducks. They will nest in a tree in a cavity. Sometimes they nest on the ground as well. They'll take what they can, but they're a duck that likes to perch. And as you can see, they're very long necked, almost like a goose. Is it a duck or a goose? Well, it's up to the scientists to get to claim that, and they classify this bird as a tree duck. But they're dramatically colored with a bright orange bill. They get together in family groups and put on great shows as you move up and down the river. And I love their eyes. I also love the eyes of wood ducks, the other tree duck along our stretch of the river. And you'll see them too in family groups. The males are the most colorful, of course, but the females are beautiful too. The eyes of wood ducks are something that you'll see. And these are also, like black-bellied whistling ducks, very vocal ducks with a squeaking call that's unmistakable. So these two ducks are my two favorites, and the most photogenic, I think, along the river. We also have wading birds, snowy egrets, but in this case, cattle egrets that congregate on the edge of the river, utilize the woody debris for perching, and then go fishing for prey in the river. You'll see these in groups morning and evening, gathering along the river as you move up and downstream. During the day, individually, you're going to see these green herons move up and down the river, hanging close to the bank, talking back to you as you chase them up and downstream, but also utilizing the Colorado River between Austin and Bastrop as home. in the water are three species of kingfishers that uh, have their own unique way of fishing. They don't wade in the water, they dive in the water. And we're very fortunate on our stretch of river to have three different species of kingfisher. The most common is the belted, but between Austin and Bastrop, the huge ringed kingfisher with its bronze belly is common. And then the tiny green kingfishers, which tend to cling to the bank and move more silently than belted kingfishers. All three of these, we call the trifecta, are common on the stretch of river, especially between Bastrop and Smithville. So if you do a trip, you always try to get all three in your sightings. But I want to end with some of the really big birds. And one of those big birds also dives in the water. Along our stretch of river, we have both resident and migratory osprey year round. You'll see these birds fishing along the river. If you're lucky, you get to see them dive in the water and catch them in front of you, fly to an electric pole or a tree and devour that fish. These are photogenic birds, these kings of fishing along the river, these fish hawks, ospreys that move up and down river. But sometimes the ospreys become victims too. And if you're moving downstream and you look up in the sky and you see an osprey and then you suddenly see a much bigger bird fly in on it, well, that's our national emblem, the bald eagle, which is a scavenging bird usually. If it doesn't have to do the work, it'll steal fish from ospreys all the time. And these are some images that a master naturalist in Bastrop caught of a bald eagle, in this case a juvenile bald eagle, its head's not white yet, harassing and chasing and stealing a fish from an osprey. So these dramas of life play out there too. Yes, our national emblem is a scavenger. Ben Franklin did not want it because of that. He wanted the wild turkey to be our national emblem because they are much cleverer than the scavenging bald eagles. But there is a nobility to this bird, and the adults are white-headed and white-tailed. We have nests along this stretch of the Colorado, so look up in pecan or cottonwood, and you may see these enormous nests that get larger every year because they use them over and over and build them bigger. And bald eagles now are common on this stretch of river. You can see them year-round because we have resident birds. You can see them more frequently in river in the winter when the migratory bald eagles will come through, and some of them stay for the winter. But they're quite a sight. And if you see an osprey, keep looking for an eagle because they're often close behind to steal their food. And I want to end, though, with something that gets called an eagle but isn't, and is very much a bird of this middle stretch of river, because these crested caracaras, as they are called, mistakenly called Mexican eagles. This is not the eagle that's on the Mexican flag. It's not an eagle at all. A caracara is actually classified with falcons. The eagle on the Mexican flag is the golden eagle. But mistakenly it gets labeled that, so you might hear people talk about them in that way. Caracaras are critters both of the river, where you'll see them perched on trees, but also of our fields along the river, of the floodplain of the Colorado, the hay fields. When hay's being cut, you'll see them there. Because these are scavengers too, like our bald eagle. So they're looking for dead fish along the river, and then in the hay fields, the victims of the hay mowers. So all of these birds are part of fluvial fauna biodiversity. The macroinvertebrates, the mammals like otters and beavers, the turtles, all of this is present along our stretch of river on this meandering middle section of the river in great abundance if you go and search for it. If you want to learn more about all of this, I want to give you two books that I recommend, which are actually three books, because the first book is by our great Texas naturalist, Roy Bedachek. Roy Bedachek, who lived in Austin, who visited the river from Austin to Smithville many times, and who's most famous for the National Book Award received for Adventures with the Texas Naturalist, his first book. If there's one book about Texas nature you must read, it's that book, Adventures with the Texas Naturalist. And then if you are interested in the Colorado River, well, you should read the first book written about the Colorado River. It's Bedachek's 1950 Karankawa Country, which focuses on the Colorado. Bedachek you can visit too, because he lives on as a statue with his two best friends, Frank Dobie and Walter Prescott Webb, at Barton Springs, where he would meet with at least Dobie. Webb didn't like Barton Springs because it was too damn cold, and you can see him here in his pants because he would never get into that thing. But Dobie and Bedachek used to meet almost every day, and this was, of course, before air conditioning, so there was a practical purpose too, and they would sit on the Philosopher's Rock and talk about nature and humans in Texas. What Bedachek had to say about the Colorado River is all summed up in Karankawa country. The Karankawas were the native peoples who lived towards the mouth of the Colorado River. That's why he claimed that title. And originally he was just going to talk about the mouth of the river. And then he realized, as he says here, a river is a living organism. And so he had to talk about the whole river system. As he says in the book, a river system is one of nature's units. And it must be dealt with as such if it is to be dealt with successfully for serving human needs. And so that's very much like the river continuum concept. And in Bedachek, we have one of our first practical ecologists. He wasn't trained as an ecologist, but in terms of his understanding of nature, it's an ecological understanding well before his time. This book from 1950 gives you a glimpse of the Colorado River from mouth up to headwaters back in time. And we're really lucky because we have a book that brings us to the present. And Margie Crisp published a number of years ago this great follow-up book on the Texas Colorado, A River of Contrast. A different approach to the river. Margie is a great visual artist, so lots of her art is in this book. And she and her husband Bill traveled up and down the river to tell tales of the Colorado, and they have a great section in it on Bastrop County because both of them live in Bastrop County. So thank you for this time, for talking about the river. Applause is accepted from all river critters, and I'll be answering questions during our question and answer period, which I believe is coming up in October, and I'll be happy to answer all your questions then. I'm sure you'll be able to get my email too, and feel free to reach out for me that way. Now I'm going to knock this down and stop sharing it, I hope.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me, Kevin?
I can hear you.
Okay, and it says I started my video. Yeah, I guess I did. Okay, so thank you so much. That was fantastic. Oh my gosh, that was amazing. I can see how your philosophy background really comes in when you're thinking about the life of the river. That was really great. See, thinking just about an entire ecosystem on one grain of sand is just kind of like mind-blowing kind of thing. It's so amazing to see such a complex food system, food web, and great diversity of ecosystem on this river system. All the different animals on the river, and understanding that the otters are making a comeback, and the alligators too. That sounds really fantastic.
And now we're looking for mink. Mink are the next to show up.
Gosh, fantastic. That'll be fun. You'll have to let us know, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, see when you find them. And all those inspiring photos are really great for our photo side too. So thanks for bringing those in as something to aspire to. And I'll check with Judy about getting some of the books into our library. So we'll see if we can get your recommended reading list into our library at some point before too long. So to the viewers, thank you again for watching this Eco Photo Fest presentation. We hope it has inspired you to take another look at the river and the life it supports. And if you really want a stellar bird watching experience, don't hesitate to head on over to Hornsby Bend or even to Riverbend Park. Anywhere along the river, we've got some really great spots for you to just camp out and look for those birds. Getting to be some great weather outside these days, so it's a really terrific time of year to do that. Thanks as always to our sponsors and to April Daniels for all of her very fine tech support on this program. We really appreciate that. And please join us for the live interaction Zoom sessions this week coming up at 6 o'clock on Tuesday, October 13th at 6, also on Thursday at October 15th. And that's when you can talk to Kevin and the other panelists for your questions about all the eco and photo sessions you've seen. Please also mark your calendars for Wednesday, October 14th at 3 p.m. if you're interested in the Outdoor Tourism Roundtable. We hope we see you there. Thank you all very much.